America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By honoring your sacred vocation of nursing, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. At Grand Canyon University, our online RN to BSN, MSN, or DNP degree programs allow you to balance online coursework with local in-person clinical, practicum, or immersion hours. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Welcome to Die Hard on a Blank, the podcast where we explore the influence of Die Hard on action cinema, one action movie at a time. I'm Philip Gawthorne, and with me as always is Liam Billingham, and today's film is Striking Distance.
It's Die Hard in a serial killer thriller, or is it Die Hard in a subpar Eugene O'Neill play? We'll find out. Next, what am I doing? Why am I like putting a cold open on the show here? Hi, Phil. How are you?
I'm great. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm really excited because we have a great guest today, Sean Fennessey. Hi, Sean.
Hey, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to share my insights in my boating career. You know, I've spent a lot of time in the high seas, and
Your boating
so this is a great film for me.
We're really excited that you're here. We're big fans of your work on the rewatchables and the big picture and the million of other. I honestly don't know how you do the million podcasts that you do, but it's an inspiration to us all. There's a funny, quick story that I have to tell about you and action movies, which is the first time I ever listened to the big picture was the day I left New York City to move to Los Angeles, California in 2019. I was on a train from New York to Boston to see my family for Christmas, and I downloaded and watched Six Underground, the Michael Bay Netflix film, and ended, and I was like, I need to process this movie with the help of some podcasters, and I believe I just typed Six Underground into Apple Podcasts, and I was like, oh, the big picture, what's this? And so you played a pivotal role in helping me understand, honestly, a bit of a forgotten action gem of a type, so to speak.
Not forgotten to me,
is.
Liam. Not forgotten to me. It lives on in my memory as an
That's
absolutely wonderful experience.
Well, this is why we wanted to get you on the show, because you take the action movies seriously, and I don't think anyone takes action movies more seriously than Phil and I do. So we're really excited to have you here. What is your favorite action movie? Do you have a favorite action movie?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for that one. Certainly, the titular film in your podcast series is meaningful to me. We did a rewatchables about that one. I do love Die Hard. I mean, I find that action movie conjures memories of the 80s and 90s, and it feels like there were just not a lot of examples of that in the 60s and 70s to most viewers and listeners' minds. But I don't know, like most war movies are action movies. You know, The Great Escape is an action movie. So I mean, I love movies like that too. I don't know that I have necessarily one that I would point to as my absolute favorite of all time, though. Die Hard, though, is a no-brainer. That's a 5-star film.
What is your history with Die Hard? When did you first see it?
I'm sure on HBO as a kid. I vividly remember seeing Die Hard with a Vengeance in movie theaters and just levitating afterwards. I mean, I love Die Hard with a Vengeance. Die Hard 2 is good. Die Hard is spectacular, though, and I think it just was kind of an instant cable classic for an 8-year-old who shouldn't have been watching it at 9:30 p.m. when a babysitter was taking care of me. You know, just the typical coming-of-age story of a insane movie kid. But I love those movies.
It was the hell of a time to be a kid.
It was a great time. It was wonderful. I mean, look at us now.
100%. So what is your history with Striking Distance? Do you remember the first time was this also an HBO or potentially Cinemax experience?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I'm pretty sure that the first time I saw this movie was with my dad, who's a cop, and his wife, and my brother. And the reason I think that is because the question, who's the best cop, has been echoing in my family for a long time. And I don't totally know why that became a gimmick a bit amongst our family, as something as just to tease our dad with at dinner. But I definitely did not see it in movie theaters. I almost certainly saw it on paid cable. Was it Cinemax? I don't think my dad had Cinemax when I was growing up, so it must have been HBO. You know, there was a divide there. You either had the full movie package with Cinemax and Showtime and the movie channel and all the other different cable, pay cable movie channels, or you just had HBO like I did. You know, it's privileged to have HBO, but I just had HBO growing up in both of my households. So I'm sure that's where I saw it. And at the time, I'm sure I thought it was kind of silly. And as I've gotten older, I have come to really appreciate the wonderful practical madness of a movie like this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was so fun to revisit it. I hadn't seen it in a really, really long time. And part of the reason I sort of jokingly said Cinemax is because I think a lot of people conflate this movie with The Color of Night. Like, it's a vaguely sexy Bruce Willis movie from the 90s that people, they kind of put them together. Someone recently was like, is that the movie where he's having sex with his therapist? And I was like, no, that's The Color of Night, but you could be mistaken.
It's the movie where he's having a hastily reshot sex scene with Sarah Jessica Parker that is deeply uncomfortable to watch in the way that it's both shot and scored. But yes, it does sort of fold into the sort of a weird, the 90s erotic thriller trend that they try to sort of jam in there. And it's, sticks out. Yeah, it's interesting to hear your thoughts about that Sean, and your memories of it, because I had wondered that whole, like, who's the best cop now? Who's the best cop now? Which is sort of a weird catchphrase in the movie. Was that something that was like you ironically attached to and then used, or was that actually a genuine conversation that would go on in that community? Because of course one of the reasons we have Sean on the show, as you just mentioned, why we picked why we were so excited for this movie, is because you can speak to being from a family of the son of a cop.
There was not a lot of jockeying inside my family for who was the best police officer, even though I am Irish American. I am not entirely from a family of cops. There were firemen, there were teachers. My dad was really the primary police officer. There were a couple of police officers before him, but it was much more tongue in cheek, much more ironic. I mean, my dad, much like myself, is a huge know-it-all, and it was always in a leadership position, but also did not like to be criticized. I've taken a lot from my father, and so it was a way to kind of needle him, I think, by posing that question in his direction.
That sounds like quite a way to have a dinner. I mean, it sounds like the way my family related to each other, which was like, is there anything we can give anyone a hard time about at any point? Then we will do it. That's how we're gonna occupy our relationships. Phil, do you want to give us some facts, some top line facts about the movie Striking Distance?
Yeah, so Striking Distance was released on September 17th, 1993 by Columbia Pictures, which was approximately 1 month after our last film, Hard Target, which was released on August 20th of that year. We're now 5 years after Die Hard, but obviously still continuing to feel its echoes, as we will unpack imminently. It was directed by Rowdy Herrington, produced by Arnon Milchan and Marty Kaplan, who also co-wrote the screenplay with Herrington. And it stars Bruce Willis, Sarah Jessica Parker, Dennis Farina, Tom Sizemore, John Mahoney, Brian James, Tom Atkins, Andre Braugher, and Robert Pastorelli. Quite the murderer's row of cast. On an estimated budget of $30 million, it grossed $77 million worldwide. That's somewhat of a misinformative figure, though, because this is considered somewhat of a failure, or barely kind of broke even. I think in the US, it was kind of it's even though those figures would suggest that it was a sizable hit, that is certainly not, I think, the perception of the studio, and of the industry at the time. This was regarded as at best a sort of base hit, tolerable return for a major studio action movie starring Bruce Willis. It has since gone on to have, I think, as we discovered when we announced that we were doing it on the show, I wouldn't say like a cultural resurgence, but it seems to be kind of fondly remembered. And it's one of the questions I did want to ask you guys, and I'm really interested in your perspective on this, Sean. It's like the difference between a movie that you might call mediocre, right? Like, if we're being unkind, because it is a mediocre movie. We like it, and we're going to get into that. But a mediocre movie of the 90s versus a mediocre movie now, a mediocre movie of the 90s is eminently watchable and thoroughly entertaining, And whereas often especially I think the straight to streaming movies now that are mediocre are often unwatchable. So, and why is that? I have my opinions on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Sean.
Well, that is a very good question, and certainly the kind of thing that I ponder on a regular basis on the shows that I'm on. I think
I was gonna say,
some of it is obviously just the rose-colored glasses of our particular generation's perspective on the way that stories were told when we were kids. And that I'm not sure that there is an objective truth in the fact that Striking Distance is better than Heart of Stone, the new Gal Gadot action movie that is on Netflix this week. But I'll say a couple things about that is important to this. One, you've got a Hollywood system that operates completely differently. So you've got people working in action movies who love movies and care deeply about the way that movies are made in the 1990s in a way that is not quite true of the 2020s. It's a harder business to be in now. It's become much more algorithmicized, as many people know. A lot of people who run studios are not art first. They're not even necessarily business first. They're often tech first. And so when you keep that in mind and you think about the way that a movie like Striking Distance is made, there are no computer generated effects in this entire movie. This is a completely practically shot, balls to the wall action movie. It's also like a serial killer thriller, as you guys said, and it is a kind of a mystery movie. It's this movie about a broken family and alcoholism and internal affairs and all these other ideas. But when it's really rollicking, it's like a cool chase movie. It feels a bit like a kind of a 70s movie, honestly. I mean, it's kind of a neo-noir, and I think that a movie like that could very well be understood to be potentially a big success in Hollywood, and that there was a reason to have the very best craftspeople, the very best stars, the very best character actors, the very best even just marketing and promotional support around a movie like this, because it was a Bruce Willis movie in 1993. I mean, that was as big as a movie could be at that time. He was one of the 10 signature stars in Hollywood in 1993. So I think that it may seem like these movies are much better, and for me, they are better personally. Like, I'm with you, Phil. But I think the apparatus of movie making has just changed so much that something that seemed like maybe a 2-star movie 30 years ago now feels significantly better, just because of what we came up admiring and now what we're forced to endure.
100%. And where the value was placed on the craft, right? Like the big thing for me, and you nailed all the points there and more, especially with the practical effects and the quality of cast. Often that's something I get so much out of when I return to these movies, is just the supporting cast, as we just listed in this movie, is incredible, but also the photography. And I was, the DP on this movie isn't like necessarily what you would call a Hall of Famer. It's Mark Alberg, who had a few Stuart Gordon collaborations and worked with John Landis on a couple of his sort of 90s movies that aren't like his ultra classics. But some of the photography in this movie, especially on the river with the lights in the background, there's a real lush look to it. It has a great dimensionality to it. And there's a sort of flat, depthless look to a lot of the direct-to-studio movies, in addition to the preponderance of computer-generated imagery and all of that. And those kind of effects that leaves me feeling a sort of distanced from it. Whereas this, I actually feel like it's a dimensional, immersive experience. And even though this isn't one of Bruce Willis's greatest movies, this isn't one of the best action movies of all time, or I think it's one of the best movies of the era, but it is still eminently enjoyable for all of those reasons. There is real craft in this film. And I actually think Rowdy Harrington is an more interesting filmmaker than what you might think, especially when this is placed in context with his debut movie, Jack's Back, which was the birth of James Spader as a movie star, and is also a serial killer story, which has a very inventive structure. So I actually think he has more to say than you might think of from the director of Roadhouse, which was his previous movie.
I just think it's a very sturdy movie as well. Like, it's just a sturdily made movie, and like it hits the beats in its way. And like I would say that, and we can get into this, there's a weird friction between the familial drama and the action serial killer elements. But one thing that's interesting that you said, Sean, is like, it's kind of a serial killer thriller. It's kind of a family drama. It's kind of this it's all these different things. And often I think weirdly streaming movies gets chastised for that. Like, oh, it's trying to do too many things. But this movie actually also is doing like a multitude of things to varying degrees of success. And part of it is that at least at the core, one thing that doing this podcast has helped me discover is really how sturdy, speaking of sturdy, Bruce Willis is in basically any movie he's in, right? Like, he's Bruce Willis. He's one of the great, he's an underrated dramatic actor, I think, even despite his later potential acclaim. And, sadly, considering where he is now, it's like, I look back with a great deal of fondness at a guy that really commits. I mean, there's a scene in this movie where he and Dennis fucking Farina are yelling at each other. Like, I'm sorry, but it just doesn't get better than them facing off. Like, it's the era of the tough guy. And I think it really just works in the sense that, like, it feels better because we're looking at something that's sturdily made by professionals. It looks beautiful and it works really, really well in that sense. I think probably for our our new listeners, our folks coming over from Sean's other incredible podcasts, The Big Picture, The Rewatchables, they probably know what this is, but maybe we should explain what Die Hard on a Blank means. So Phil, when you say Die Hard on a Blank, what do you mean?
Yeah, so real quick, this term is industry or cultural shorthand for any movie that utilizes that particular storytelling paradigm, which is of a Die Hard scenario, which broadly is bad guys take over a blank, and it's up to one guy or gal or group of folks to fight back. Obviously, the Die Hard on a Blank has been used for, the Die Hard on a boat, Die Hard on a bus, Die Hard on a
in
surfboard,
an ice cream truck.
Other,
for those that like
various
that film.
Other,
what's that film called again? I can't remember.
Chill
Factor with Skeet Ulrich.
It's on the list.
Right.
It's on the list. The public are
Everyone's
clamoring
talking
for our
about Chill Factor
episode.
The Skeet Ulrich heads are like...
Film Twitter is lit up about Chill Factor. It's all I hear.
When are you going to do Chill Factor?
On The Big Picture, Sean. Come on,
be a
let's
while,
go.
guys.
Yeah. So whereas this film, but obviously we're tracking the specific Die Hard imitators on the show, the Passenger 57s, Under Sieges, Toy Soldiers, and so forth. But we're also looking at the ways that are more subtle that Die Hard has influenced the action genre, and it influenced it in a very specific way with this film because. And we'll get to this when we get into the premise. The obvious thing is that this is a Bruce Willis movie, but it also, I think, the gravity of this film was bent because of Die Hard's influence, turning it from what Rowdy Herrington intended it to be, which I think was a serious, a family drama, murder mystery set in a very specific cultural milieu of his hometown of Pittsburgh, into a Bruce Willis action movie. So we'll move into our section about Die Hard DNA, where we kind of pin that.
Phil, I hate to interrupt you, but it's
we'll get a little
not
more
Die Hard
specific.
DNA, as this is a 90s film podcast. It's Die Hard DNA. I had to do it. I'm sorry. I had to do it. It's important. It's important to make...
For people who like very, very specific Jurassic Park references.
Yeah, that's where we are.
That's your section there. We got you covered. So, the Die Hard DNA, obviously Bruce Willis stars, once again playing a detective, just as he did in Die Hard 1 and 2 and The Last Boy Scout, all of which we've covered so far on the show. As in many of his action movies, Bruce also takes a lot of physical punishment.
It's every movie he gets the shit kicked out of him. It's great. It makes him relatable, I think.
He has a pronounced limp in this one because of the car accident, much like McClane at the end of Die Hard. The producer of the movie, Arnon Milchan, very prolific producer, made several Die Hard style films, including the Under Siege movies, Murder at 1600, The Negotiator. Also made Heat, amongst many other prestigious films. And this is another aspect of which I'm interested in your perspective on, Sean, is although the hero is again a maverick cop, like Die Hard, I think this film has a very similarly suspicious and cynical view of certain law enforcement institutions, which is something that we've talked about a lot with Die Hard. Even though Bruce Willis is a cop in the movie, that is very suspicious of the police, of the FBI, of state power, and so forth. So there is another connection there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I do. That's part of the reason why I suggested that there's a bit of 70s neo-noir, not quite conspiracy, but there is a conspiratorial element that reveals itself at the end of the movie. I'm not sure if Rowdy Herrington is necessarily like in the lineage of Alan Pakula, but he's not. He's not just making a dumb action movie. And I think that's reasonable, and that's something that allows for a lot of movies like this to elide the claims of propaganda. Like it's very similar to like the way that Humphrey Bogart movies. Bogart could be somebody who works inside the system but outside the system simultaneously. That Willis's characters are often smarter than everyone else, a little bit more rumpled than everyone else. You mentioned that he gets the shit beat out of him pretty frequently because he doesn't have this imposing physique. He has to show the audience that like he is closer to them than he is to Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that just makes us like associate with him more. And I think also like it's an increasingly cynical time in history. We're kind of exiting the Reagan 80s, and it's a moment where I think there's a little bit more Gen X skepticism about power in the country. And so I think it certainly improves upon what could have otherwise just been a noisy crash bang kind of conclusion to the film. That's sort of revealing, although clearly very telegraphed when you revisit the movie. I mean, I would not say this is a subtle telling of this kind of suspicion of power, but when it does kind of rip the cover off at the end, it's satisfying. You don't just feel like you watched something dumb.
I totally agree. And it's interesting, you mentioned Pakula. The other name that I thought of a little bit when I was revisiting this was Sidney Lumet, and movies like Prince of the City, which are deeply ensconced in a very, very specific cultural milieu about this kind of tribal, insular culture of cops and what happens when people kind of cross these lines of loyalty. I mean, in screenwriting, we have the term like theme stated, right? And it usually appears within you kind of want it to be in the first 10 pages. And in this movie, John Mahoney says it, I think, in like minute 2, loyalty above all else except honor. And that's actually what this film is exploring. And a movie like Prince of the City or Serpico or a Q&A or many Nightfalls on Manhattan, basically half of Sidney Lumet's filmography in some ways are experiencing or exploring that same thematic idea. So I think this film does sort of stand on the shoulders of those movies that, as you're saying, from the 70s to some extent, but it intersects violently with the post Die Hard Bruce Willis action movie trend that was sort of ratcheting up in this era.
It also has something in common, like with a film like Backdraft, which again is this white working class ethnic families all have the same profession. The challenges of like doing a job set against some kind of intrigue, whether it's an arsonist or a serial killer or someone, a family member getting revenge, whatever it happens to be. Like I was saying to Phil, it would be an interesting movie to pair with Backdraft because they're both sort of action movies that also, there was this moment, and in the 90s where you got these kinds of movies that were about tribal communities, right? You got this, Backdraft, The Devil's Own, this kind of that you don't get in action movies anymore, the kind of regular working class people pushed to extremes and forced to kind of like root out the issues, and starring these incredible actors.
And big ensemble casts, right? Like the cast in Backdraft is unbelievable. The cast in this is pretty spectacular as well. That's sort of become a bit of a lost art. It's still driven by a big star, Kurt Russell, Backdraft.
And interestingly, both feature sort of like firemen's balls or police balls, these things that like really happen in tight-knit communities and everything goes to shit. Like inevitably there's a fist fight. Like it's
people
very
get drunk. Yeah.
It feels very specific to like, I mean, Sean, I think you grew up on Long Island. I grew up in Boston. It's that same kind of like a little bit, from my point of view, insular rooted communities that all do the same things, and there's the classic antagonisms between them.
It's a funny thing about how these movies are made, because Backdraft's an interesting comparison. If you watch Striking Distance or Backdraft, or it's not dissimilar from a movie like The Deer Hunter, weirdly, where you'd think that all of the people in that town only had that job. There are only cops in Pittsburgh.
Another Pittsburgh movie.
Another Pittsburgh movie. That's right. Like Barry Bonds does not live in this Pittsburgh. Mario Lemieux does not live in this Pittsburgh. Like this is a town of white middle class, somewhat aggrieved police officers. And I mean, Copland is another movie that is like this. There are a lot of movies that are like this. And it's It's not as common now for a variety of reasons. I think communities like this are seen much differently than they were by mainstream audiences 30 years ago. But it's not inaccurate. I mean, growing up, most of my dad's friends were cops, and being a police officer is a kind of a round-the-clock profession. My dad worked nights when I was a kid. Oftentimes, he was working 12, 14-hour shifts. And was he working those entire 14 hours? Probably not. He was probably at the bar for some of those times, but he was usually at the bar with other cops. And so these communities kind of form around each other because people are looking for like-minded. It's the same reason some of my best friends are podcasters. You know, I'm just looking for people who understand my perspective on the world. And so it's a reasonable way to make a movie, I think.
I was going to talk about that a little later. I wanted to ask you about that exact question, but as you brought it up, you know, this is a film that precedes a series of films that also had an ensemble cast that explored this insular tribal world of urban police cultures. You just mentioned one of them, and you guys did an amazing episode on it, Copland, which I just re-listened to for the second
Sorry,
time.
I had to.
If you want to do your "You blew it," Sean,
my hands are tied now.
We got it. Phil, we got it. End the recording. No, I'm just kidding.
But there's Copland, then there was The Negotiator, We Own the Night, The Wire, and then TV shows like The Wire, We Own This City, Pride and Glory, which I thought was a really underrated one with Ed Norton and Colin Farrell. What you're from this world to some extent. Which films do you feel have got it right in terms of capturing that cultural milieu? Which ones have been accurate? Which ones have been inaccurate, and why? I'm fascinated to hear your perspective on that as someone who kind of lived it.
Well, you know, not to sound like every technical advisor in Hollywood history, but like none of them really get it right? Because they're movies, like they're constructs. I think that there are some movies that maybe feel like a little bit more sincere about the people that they're trying to portray, or the work that is done in certain communities. I think I'm much more emotionally open to a sort of more earnest and dramatic portrayal like Pride and Glory or like Copland, these movies that feel like much more less interested in the action and more interested in the human dynamics. But that being said, like, cops are not poets, and so a lot of the times when you hear characters talk in movies like this, it's like that's not really how cops speak to each other, and that's not what they would talk about. You know, there's a lot of talk about like the complicated nature of the family and the work of being a police officer in these movies, and like that's not, my dad didn't talk about that. That's not his life was about the Mets, and it was about taking his daughter to soccer practice, and it was about it might have even been about something like politics. It might have been like what's on TV right now, but it wasn't going to be about the specifics of the day-to-day of his job, because it was his job. So I think that like a movie like this is sort of forced to dramatize the very specific aspects of life that most people would not discuss on a day-to-day basis. So it's hard to say like what is accurate and what's not accurate. I just like the idea of a more sincere portrayal of these kinds of jobs, because so many of the people who do them are often so taciturn. You know, cops and firemen in particular, I find to be like these complex internal guys who are really repressed a lot of the time. Obviously, there's women in those roles too, but the men in particular are very repressed. And so when you find a movie that sort of like forces characters to open up and talk about their experiences, I'm intrigued by that as somebody who maybe has not always been able to get his own dad to open up about some of those experiences. But that's the interesting thing about the movies, I think.
I think there's also like an interesting, I'm sure we'll get into, we have a whole Farina conversation to have, but I think this is also coming off an age when guys, the actors in these movies, like did other things. They were war veterans, or they had been cops in the case of Farina, or they'd had these lives, and acting was like either a second career or something they stumbled into. And so it's like, you know, Bruce Willis was like a regular guy for a long time before he became this big actor. And I think you can feel that in the soul of a performer, like an actor who's really lived and existed. And whereas now, you know, actors are so sort of trained, and I don't want to be the guy that's reactionary and say that it's like, it's different than it was, but there's a certain amount of like, an actor has a persona that's related to acting, whereas they used to have like accumulated years of knowledge. And I think there's an authenticity that comes through when you have a Farina, when you have a Willis, like a guy who looks like he's had a job his whole life playing these parts, and that doesn't exist in mainstream Hollywood in the way that it used to.
It's often so polished now that all of those corners and edges and the reality of it is often sort of sanded off by these, as you say, this is a great cast of character actors that could put on a play in a bar in any East Coast city and whatever, right? Like they definitely feel like authentic people that you see in the real world, as opposed to sort of polished Hollywood, Hollywood actors, and that does it and an air of authenticity to the milieu that they're trying to capture.
I mean, it always feels like it comes back to Cassavetes for me on some level. This kind of like actors who are real people, and you can always draw a line to a lot of action movies and Killing of a Chinese Bookie. They're not necessarily related, but there's like a kind of white ethnic maleness to these leading figures from the forever, but you can feel it in the 70s and 80s, and it sort of moves into the 90s in this like really specific way. But Phil, should we get into our section, Anatomy of an Action Movie?
We absolutely
where
should.
We list the tenets. We live in a twilight world.
No Friends at Dusk.
Of the action film. And there are 6. Sean, I know you're a Tenet guy, so I knew you would be on board with that.
My heart is fluttering. I love it so much.
Yes, that's fantastic. As long as it's beating forwards and not backwards.
So Tenet is the thinking man's Six Underground.
The thinking man's...
That's my hot take. Think about that.
Or is it the other way around? Have you considered that?
It flows in both directions temporally.
The tenets of the Anatomy of an Action Movie are premise, ticking clock, hero, villain, action, humor, and leading lady. For a second there, I feel like I sounded like an AI. I was like, hero, villain, like it was.
Have you been replaced already? They're
they got
coming for
future
us too?
me to invert, and now I'm here, and I'm in.
Not the podcasters! No! Damn you, technology! Leave us something.
Oh my god!
So the premise of this movie is thus. Okay, after he testifies against his own partner for use of excessive force, Pittsburgh homicide detective Thomas Hardy is excommunicated from the tight-knit police department and ends up working for the River Rescue Division, where he becomes embroiled in a hunt for a serial killer who is dumping bodies in the water. As he launches his own unofficial investigation into the crimes, Hardy comes to suspect that the killer may be the very same man who murdered his police captain father years earlier. Now, there's a lot, even that is quite an unwieldy description that sort of shows how there's like 5 movies packed into this into this film, and it's only 101 minutes, but it's trying to achieve a lot. The ticking clock within that is can Hardy solve the mystery and find the killer before he strikes again? Simple, murder mystery mechanic. There's nothing particularly revelatory or inventive about that premise, I would say, unlike Rowdy Harrington's first film, Jack's Back, which has an incredible structural conceit that kickstarts the film. It's real. I really urge people to seek it out, but to say more would be to spoil it. But it's like peak early James Spader.
This. Oh no, I guess we can't spoil that. That's fine. Okay, yeah, Jack's Back is
it's just a really right. cool thing. I'd just say go and watch it. And I think when you look at Rowdy Harrington's subsequent films through the lens of the guy that wrote and directed Jack's Back, it does make you think actually there's more going on with this guy than might meet the eye. But this also, it's interesting to note that this film, as a serial killer thriller, which is one of the lenses through which we're looking at it today, it preceded Seven, which would kickstart the serial killer thriller boom of the 90s. That I think that's worth touching on.
It's funny because do you guys think of this as a serial killer movie? Like, I don't. I think of this as a Bruce Willis on the river kind of movie.
It's an interesting question. Are all of the murders in the second half of the film entirely to taunt Bruce Willis's character? And if they are, does that make the killer a serial killer? Or does that break the definition of what a serial killer is? Sort of more of a revenge tale than a serial killer, ultimately, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just a man who's drifting through the world killing strangers.
Yeah. That's why it's like it's when I think of this movie, revisiting it, I had a couple different takes on it, but like it's it's a revenge thriller. It's also kind of a police procedural. It's like, but ultimately, I think that what you're speaking to is like the lack of the slightly schizophrenic nature of what is going on in this movie, which is like it's all of these things at the same time.
Maybe that is somewhat of a, we've called it Die Hard in a serial killer thrill, but maybe that's something of a misnomer. There was another point that I did want to make here, which I think you guys will find very, very interesting about this, which would speak to the tension within the film as to which is it? Is it a serial killer film, a murder mystery, a family drama, an action movie, all of these things? Robert De Niro was originally attached to play the lead in this film, which I found fascinating because this is not De Niro. This is De Niro in 1993, right? He is very, very selective about the movies that he's doing, the people that he's working with, the roles that he's picking, right? This is, what, like Mad Dog and Glory and This Boy's Life and obviously post Goodfellas. And he is at the peak of his powers and picking very, very interesting parts and projects and not just, looking for... Robert De Niro is not doing action movies, is my point. He's doing an interesting part and an interesting story that gives him the space to act. And I think he goes on to basically make a different version of that film. So this film, City by the Sea, is set in this faded town of Long Beach, New York, and he is chasing a son who he thinks has committed a murder. And it's actually an amazing performance by De Niro, particularly the final scene is some of the most vulnerable, extraordinarily moving acting I've ever seen him do. So I think that speaks to what the original intention of this movie was and then what it ended up becoming, because I think then they tried to get Mel Gibson, it ended up being Bruce Willis, and yet Bruce Willis still wanted to make a dark drama. That's what he was drawn to. But the studio didn't want that. They want the Bruce Willis action movie, the post-Die Hard Bruce Willis.
There was an interesting article in the Pittsburgh newspaper, because this is 30 years old this year, where he and Rowdy Harrington had fights on set because he was like, what is this movie we're making? We were making a different movie when I agreed to do this script. And Rowdy Harrington sort of says, like, he was difficult to work with. But I think it's because Bruce Willis was kind of tired of being a guy running around with a gun and wanted to do something different. So I think that could have been part of it too.
Here's an interesting thing about Bruce Willis. Guess how many roles he had in the 1990s? How many film roles did he have?
26.
17.
He had 32 film roles in the 1990s. He worked a lot. And he was obsessed with, once he created his own stardom, finding ways to subvert his own idea of stardom. Striking Distance, I think you're right, Phil, is an attempt to simultaneously use his saleability and his persona and also undermine it a little bit. What's the movie he makes immediately after Striking Distance? Pulp Fiction. What are the movies he goes on to make in the immediate aftermath of Pulp Fiction? North, Color of Night, Nobody's Fool. Those are supporting performances or very strange erotic thrillers. He goes on to make 4 Rooms and 12 Monkeys and Last Man Standing, a remake of a Kurosawa movie. I mean, he's really searching for a kind of complicated artistry while still being a big time movie star. So I think your reading, Phil, is completely right. And unfortunately, it feels like whether it's Rowdy Harrington or the studio or just the natural sense of inertia that comes from making a mystery as opposed to an action movie, the movie is kind of shifting in real time. And what it's really trying to be is kind of changing as you're watching it.
Well, to that point, like I made this joke early on, and we've been talking about this. This is a little bit like a Eugene O'Neill play, right? And like the one that there's a million connections you could make, but the one that I go to is the most obvious to me, which is, and I'm sure a theater historian will tell me there's another that's closer, but Long Day's Journey into Night, which features the members of a family 4: James, Mary, Jamie, and Edmund, and James is the older, he's the father, he's charismatic, he's charming, he knows everybody. He has this really clear Farina connection where Farina is like the affable guy that people like, but he's, like the alcoholism and A Long Day's Journey into Night, he's hiding in the same way that Farina is hiding this dark knowledge about his family. There's like a really clear corollary between like the golden child who is Pastorelli, who, falls apart because of his choices in life, and they're hiding the truth about who he is, and the fuck up son in this case played by Tom Sizemore, and I think a kind of very sad performance, who feels like the younger brother, who's Edmund, and the mother in Long Day's Journey into Night, Mary, is she's present, so she's different. It's different from Striking Distance, but she's an alcoholic who is like deeply unwell, and in this film she's dead. She's gone by suicide, if I'm remembering correctly, Phil.
Yeah, off screen as backstory, it's very significant, the absent mother,
right?
And the absence of women generally in this world, apart from Sarah Jessica Parker and and the victims. There's the Kim Lee character, but this is a world that is pure machismo and patriarchy, and the female presence and the maternal presence is entirely absent. I think totally by intention.
And it's just as much about dysfunctional families, or there's a version of this movie that is more of a dysfunctional family movie, and I we'll get into the antagonists and as we get further into this, but there's definitely like Roddy Harrington writing, and is from Pittsburgh, and is writing his attempt at some kind of the great American play kind of thing in the spirit of O'Neill, or Arthur Miller is definitely another correlation. I was joking that like it's like A View from the River. Like there's this real drama at the core of this thing. Let's talk about Bruce.
Are we giving this movie too much credit?
Oh, yeah, no, that's what we do here. Yeah, no, I think you're right.
we connect Dostoevsky to Striking Distance.
Phil recently told me
like,
that
just,
you like every movie, and it's like, no, it's not that I like every movie, because there's plenty of movies I don't like, but I feel a need to like. The thesis statement is to take these things as the movies as seriously as we can, of course. But yeah, we're probably giving it way too much credit.
It doesn't mean. I think that whether his intent, whether Rowdy Harrington is, I think some of his influences, like we're saying, were maybe Pacula, Lumet, and perhaps some of these plays. We're not saying that he achieved that, right? Like, I don't think it was. Basically, there's just a more interesting movie than meets the eye, I think, hidden inside this movie. But I do want to ask you a bit more about Bruce Willis, Sean, and your thoughts on him. Just to talk about this section of the hero. He plays a character called Tom Hardy, a name of another movie star.
Wait, stop, Sean. Do you want to do your Bane impression?
I can only do Aidan Gillen asking where
You're
Bane
much
is.
Vaunted.
Where's Bane? I can't. I have stage fright.
Uncanny.
Perhaps he's wondering why you would shoot a man before throwing him out of an airplane. Oh, so good.
Liam's a big Dark Knight Rises apologist.
Apologist, get out of here.
The fire rises, guys. The fire rises.
The fire rises.
This character's kind of unlikable, I would say, right? Borderline unlikable. He's like a mopey, sexist, immature, self-pitying drunk, right? But Bruce Willis has such charm and charisma that he still makes him, I think, likable and sympathetic. Also notable, this started the tough guy with a cat trend. See also Stallone in Assassins for all you tough guy with a cat fans. But I am interested because you've sort of teed it up beautifully, Sean, with this idea about Bruce Willis being similarly more complex, I think, than meets the eye. What are your feelings on Bruce as an actor, and what are your favorite performances of his?
Well, it's a good question. It's a complicated question. I'm certainly a fan of him as a film presence. I probably think of him as movie star first and actor second. I also definitely had a consciousness of him as a persona breaking actor pretty early on because of my obsession with Pulp Fiction, because of that shock of seeing Pulp Fiction for the first time and it being nearly more than an hour into the film when you first saw Butch. And how like stunning that was in a way, the idea that like he was in that movie, and even though it was sold against him, the guy, for the movie to not open with, John McClane was very confusing at the time, and that was, I think, kind of instructive in understanding like the way that you can kind of disassemble movie structure and movie expectation. But I like him quite a bit. I mean, it's obviously quite sad what's going on with him, and what happened to him in the business over the last few years. I find that really upsetting to think about. But I really appreciate the fact that he was someone who was always kind of searching for a kind of artistic legitimacy inside of the Hollywood product, because that's something that I'm personally interested in. Like, I really like Hollywood and the idea of Hollywood being this kind of mass entertainment complex that is still using art to share ideas with the world. And you can see in like the filmmakers, even in the movies of his that are like big bombs or that we don't think are very good, you can kind of see what he's after or what he sees, like he makes a, Day of the Jackal remake that isn't very good, but like he's interested in the Jackal and the Day of the Jackal, he is working with Walter Hill on a Kurosawa remake. He's working with Richard Rush, the, director of The Stuntman. Like there's something there. He's always looking for something compelling. Now, on the other hand, the stories of him working with him at this time are legion about how difficult he was to work with, about how much he knew he was a star and he knew he was the box office, and he would use that to kind of leverage himself, to put himself in a position of power. But I have always liked him. I think he strikes me as one of the few stars from this era who runs the risk of being forgotten. And I don't mean that to kind of cast any aspersions on him, but aside from Die Hard, I don't know if there are a lot of his films that will stand the test of time, if you know what I mean by that. I think a lot of his movies now have like, I guess maybe The Sixth Sense is probably the only other one that I think probably has a chance to kind of persist through time. But like movies like Armageddon, which were huge at the time and now are still loved by our generation, I think are kind of a punchline in a way. We're joking about Six Underground, but Michael Bay has kind of become a punchline to younger people. And I think like a lot of the stuff that he did, a lot of the chances that he took weirdly worked against him, rather than trying to just very neatly protect his legacy with every specific choice that he could have made. So there's me on the one side liking him and me on the other side seeing like, how will Bruce Willis be remembered? Will he just be like the Robert Ryan of his era, or will he be the Burt Lancaster of his era? There's like a pretty distinct difference between those two actors.
And if people want to know more, I think see what Bruce Willis was truly capable of as an actor, watch 12 Monkeys. Because I think that is arguably his greatest ever performance. And there was so much more to him than the persona, which was essentially John McClane. And often, if you look at his career through this time, it was the Die Hard movies that kind of course-corrected him after flops, right? Like Bonfire of the Vanities or Hudson Hawk. Okay, Die Hard 2's out, it's okay. In the mid-90s, some of these stranger choices like North or whatnot, okay, there's another Die Hard movie coming out. It often just keeps his box office viability alive, and perhaps afforded him some of that slack to make more strange and esoteric choices. Liam and I are endlessly fascinated by the fact that there is somewhere, and we need to get hold of it, a videoed recording of True West with him being in it, which is one of my favorite plays of all time by Sam Shepard. And I think, there really is an interesting artist there, but it's almost like his early success.
Opposite, Phil?
I'm not sure. I can't remember.
Chad Smith played Austin.
Oh, okay, great. Okay. Thanks
Bruce
for pulling
Willis
that
played
up.
Lee. So Chad Austin was in Tears of the Sun. He was in Hostage. He was in The Package, the Andrew Davis movie. The Andrew Davis movie, I shouldn't say, not Andrew Davis movie. So I can't pull him out. Like, I don't remember Chad Smith. Maybe you guys do, but he clearly had a good relationship with Willis because he's in two of his movies, of which Tears of the Sun I completely forgot about. But that would be so fascinating to see, and to see him play that part. Because Lee is the drifter.
Yeah. I think he's playing the boorish, bullying older brother, right? As I recall. But anyway, we obviously we love Bruce Willis on this show. It goes without saying. But just transitioning here, we talked about this, and as you said, Sean, are we giving this movie too much credit? Perhaps, right? As a Bruce Willis action movie, let's be honest, right? This is fair. This is a 3-star at best, I would say, right? It's average, it's entertaining, but it's no Last Boy Scout, right? However, as a Dennis Farina character drama, I think it's pretty great. The movie that Dennis Farina is in is fascinating to me, and it runs parallel to the main movie. It's just slightly out of frame for most of the movie. Just to explain, Dennis Farina plays a character called Nick Totillo, who is a high-ranking police captain. He's the uncle of Bruce Willis's character in the film. They butt heads throughout, but there's clearly like love and affection between them. And it's eventually revealed, spoiler alert, that the serial killer whom everyone is chasing is in fact Nick's son and Hardy's former partner, Jimmy DiTillo, played by Robert Pastorelli. And Nick knows this throughout. He's been protecting Jimmy throughout until finally his conscience can no longer take it. You know, when I was watching it last night, and I was looking at the bit where he's like holding the cross towards the end. I'm like, this guy's in an Abel Ferrara movie. Like it's amazing. So the film is unusual because Farina goes on an actual character arc, right? And does real heavy lifting as an actor. Usually he kind of shows up as a cop or a gangster in a heavy, and he's incredible, but he sort of stays the same, right? For the most part, he's like maybe the fifth name on the call sheet. He's absolutely rock solid and is amazing. But this, he has a real arc. And it builds to this incredible confrontation with his own son, which is quite Reservoir Dogs-esque, multi-layered Mexican standoff. Stop pointing that fucking gun at my dad, etc., etc.
It's a pretty good Chris Penn.
So my question. Thanks. My question for Sean, I'm going to shut up now. Now, you have met Dennis Farina, I believe, or you've interviewed him. I'm really interested in your thoughts and impressions of this legendary figure and how you would rank his performance in this film. Is this his best acting performance?
Bold.
And if not, what are your thoughts on this icon that is Farina, having I think interviewed him and studied him?
Yeah, I've told the story a couple times about interviewing him. I'm going to say 10, 15 years ago. And I was very excited to speak with him. He's from a long line of, as I think, Liam, you mentioned the person who had a life and career before they got into Hollywood, and him being a police officer and being interested in that experience. And so I opened, as I think was reasonable at the time, in what I had hoped would be a career spanning interview, to say like, hey, Dennis, you're an amazing performer. How did you get started in the business? And he was like, fuck, Sean. Jesus, you want me to tell that fucking story again? No way. And he could not have been less interested in doing the hagiography thing whatsoever. He did not want to talk about Michael Mann. He did not want to talk about Midnight Run. He did not want to talk. And it wasn't because he disliked those things. He was just sick and tired of talking about old war stories, basically. And so we had a much different kind of conversation about his life and how he thought about his career, and it was a good talk, but it probably wasn't what I was hoping for, which is him telling war stories of like making the transition to become an actor. He's a guy who obviously I'm like always very happy to see in a movie. Up until this point, he had been primarily a TV actor. He of course had like legendary roles in Manhunter and in Midnight Run, unforgettable roles, but he really wasn't a movie actor. And so this is a big meaty part for a guy who was meant to just kind of seem intimidating and somewhat funny in series television, network series television in the late 80s. So it's fascinating that he got this opportunity. You kind of feel like this opportunity led to things like Out of Sight and Saving Private Ryan and these like slightly more complicated roles, smaller roles, but more like emotional roles that he then is asked to perform because, a Chicago cop, you would not think would be capable of this kind of work. The person he reminds me of, actually, and the person who I thought of while watching this is Joseph Wambaugh. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with him. He was a novelist in the 70s, and he was an ex-cop. He was an LAPD cop for like 15 years. He had a very, very similar career trajectory to my dad, who effectively worked all the way up until he became a detective sergeant. And then he led a team for a while, and then he retired, and then he wrote books about his experience. He wrote The Onion Field. He wrote The New Centurions.
Right.
It's a great movie, The New Centurions. Yeah, Choir Boys. He wrote right. Black Marble. He's written some really good books. And he's another guy.
Did The Onion Field get turned into a movie?
It did,
The Onion Field a movie?
Yeah, with James Woods.
It was on Criterion like a couple years ago. I remember watching it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good. It's a nasty movie. I mean, a lot of his movies are very unsparing about how unpleasant it was to live and work in Los Angeles in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But he went on and had like a 30-year award-winning career as a novelist after his time as a police officer. That's not necessarily rare, but it's rare to do it in such a high-profile way, the same way that Farina did. I mean, Farina was a cop for 15 years in Chicago before he went on to become this kind of impressive actor with a very identifiable screen presence. When you see him, he's probably going to be a guy who thinks he's smarter than you, who's got a little bit of a bad attitude, who's probably in a position of authority, whether it be a mob boss or a police captain. And he's just damn good in everything he does. I think you're right though, Phil, that he's unique and more emotionally bold in this movie than he's usually asked to be.
And he breaks down. He breaks down and cries at the end of the film. You don't usually see Farina be vulnerable. I think for the most part, that
I think
can
it stands really in contrast to the Robert Pastorelli performance, who's the villain of the film, who's like, it's the thankless part, because I think that twist is kind of like, okay, like it's not as surprising as it should be, and it seems a little obvious, but it's not emotional because we have no investment in Robert Pastorelli's character of Jimmy, and so it comes off to me as a little like just the silly, crazy guy at the end. I don't think it would necessarily be more surprising, but I've often wondered if it'd be more interesting if Sizemore is the killer and this kind of fucked up persona where he like gets drunk at the policeman's ball is like a performance, and he's actually very calculated. Like I hadn't seen the movie in so long that I was like, wait, is Sizemore the killer? And I just think, unfortunately, Pastorelli, who also passed away, it's just not. He's barely a villain because he's barely in the movie.
I think he's trying to do something which I like the choice, but not the execution with Pastorelli. I think he's trying to convey a childlike character, hence the whole, like we talked about, he has the iconography of childhood, the police radio control car.
Oh, that's true.
And
yeah.
Who's the best cop. And, he's sort of stuck in a state of arrested development, right? Like, psychologically and whatnot. But it's too broad. It's too unsubtle. I think, like in the early scenes in First Blood, for example, Stallone talked about how before he kind of gets into the dispute with Dennehy, that he saw Rambo as a childlike character. When he goes to visit the relative of his lost buddy, comrade in arms, he's playing it. It's very sort of innocent and sweet and kind of shy. The stuff that Stallone does really, really, really well. That's like a good example, I think, of doing a grown man trying to convey a childlike character. What Pastorelli, I think, just goes. He kind of swings for the fences. He always has. He always did as an actor. He tends to be very big, makes big, bold choices. Now, I do think it's an entertaining performance as Jimmy Detillo, but I don't. You also make a good point structurally, Liam. Yeah, because we only meet him for sort of 10 minutes, and it's like he's sort of a bit of a jerk and bit of a sort of weird, childish, self-pitying oddball. Then he jumps off the bridge. We don't have a ton of investment in him as a character, but he has done. He did a really interesting movie that I can't get out of my head. That was, I can't remember the American title. In the UK, it was called Painted Heart, when he also played a killer, and it was opposite Will Patton and Bebe Neuwirth. And it was a sort of noir love triangle from, I think, the same year, 1993. And it had this extraordinary scene that always stayed with me because they were house painters.
It's called The Paint Job in the US.
There you go. That's the one. Yes. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but it ends.
I didn't even know that movie existed.
It ends with a scene in this White House where the two male figures in the love triangle attack each other with paint cans. So it ends up being this sort of Jackson Pollock imagery it's really kind of an amazing sort of lost noir from that era of like the Red Rock Wests of that time. And he's excellent in that. And I think he's really good in Be Cool. Speaking of Elmore Leonard and the Farina connection, where he plays a character called Joe Loop, who's a sort of colorful, gangster type character, but his tonality as an actor is commensurate with the tonality of Be Cool, which is slightly over the top and slightly exaggerated, but it's not commensurate with Farina, right? Who cannot play a false note. It's just so naturalistic and authentic and whatnot. So I think he doesn't totally fit, but it's an entertaining performance, if not, I would say, completely successful. That's my kind of 2 cents on.
It's an interesting time to cast him too, because it is deeply against type to Eldon, the painter he played on Murphy Brown. He was on Murphy Brown for years and years in the U.S. at this time. And Murphy Brown was one of the 10 most watched shows in America for this stretch of time. This is right in the aftermath of the Dan Quayle controversies of that show, and so there was a real zoom in on that. And I don't remember how he intersected necessarily with Murphy's pregnancy, but he was like in Murphy Brown's house, his character, Robert Pastorelli's character, and so he was on in my house all the time, and he was this kind of laid back, avuncular, almost sage-like painter figure, and also like, venting board for Murphy's frustrations, and very different from the insane childlike killer in Striking Distance. So for when I saw him, this might have been the first time that I saw him not in Murphy Brown, and he's different.
Right. He's also of that class of, I mean, we made the joke of the Reservoir Dogs, stop pointing the gun at my dad, but that Chris Penn, Robert Pastorelli, like those kinds of guys who were sort of movie stars in the early 90s, like Italian, larger-than-life figures, and it's just a really strange performance. I totally forgot about the Murphy Brown thing, and I have to go home and watch The Paint Job on Tubi. God bless Tubi. I think it's on.
It's a pretty horny
it's
movie.
On Tubi. It sounds like it.
Should we move on to the action and just cover that?
Action,
obviously,
humor.
As an action movie, is this successful on those terms? Are there set pieces memorable? I have to say, the opening car chase with Mahoney and Willis in the car, and they're having this casual conversation.
Thumbs up.
Is pretty fun. I love that spin that they're talking about his love life while they're in the middle of a car chase. But it did give me serious Simpsons McBain vibes, or more specifically, Chief Wiggum PI, the Simpsons spin-off where Wiggum goes to New Orleans. It had, especially with the Brad Fiedels.
I just want to say
this
is the only podcast that makes a reference to Chief Wiggum PI and Long Day's Journey into Night in 1 hour-long recording session. Thank you very much.
Challenge accepted on that, just going forward.
This, I thought a little bit about Jade, another 90s thriller, much more erotic. Maybe it's just because, unfortunately, we just lost William Friedkin, but I think it's a pretty good chase. I also think the river pursuit is good. Do you have a favorite chase in this movie, Sean?
Definitely the opening chase, which I think is really well done. I think that the especially the riding down, the kind of like bouncing off the hills as the cars are going down and down and down is like, I legitimately was like, oh my, I'm not sure if I've seen that shot quite that way before. This is really seems legitimately authentic.
Rowdy Harrington can direct action. He can direct. He's a good action director, especially if you look at the finale of Roadhouse, which we talked about with that Mercedes stunt crashing into Ben Gazzara's. How this has similar, quite striking, no pun intended, shot where the two cars fly over the hill out of control, and then that becomes the sort of trigger for the flashback later when the full reveal of what happened to John Mahoney at Farina's hands comes out. That stuff is really well done, and shooting chases on a river,
no joke,
is I've never seen that. And that's going to be hard to film. And it's pretty dynamic.
Is this movie funny though? Is the next question. I don't know. Is it?
It's
not particularly,
I don't think
in my opinion. I mean, it's a problem of tone.
There are things about it that are funny, but it is not humorous.
Right. Well, Robert Pastorelli especially, it's like he's doing this I'm crazy thing at the end, and it just doesn't jive with the fact that he's been taunting his cousin by murdering women in his life, including an innocent dispatcher who has 2 minutes of screen time in the movie. It's kind of wild.
Yeah, poor Kim
Speaking
Lee.
of, our final category of the anatomy of an action movie, The Lady, which is Sarah Jessica Parker as Joe Christman / Emily Harper. I'm just going to say it. I think Bruce Willis and Sarah Jessica Parker are attractive people, and I like looking at them in this movie. I just think that that's the fair thing to say about this.
Do they have chemistry?
Let me speak.
Do they have chemistry?
Please, I'm not sure. I don't know.
Let me speak about this. Are they? Is anyone in this movie beautiful? Because I think that's kind of its charm. Even Bruce Willis, sure, he looks like a movie star. Sure, Sarah Jessica Parker, great TV star of our time. But this is actually kind of a movie full of regular looking people. Sarah Jessica Parker, by contrast to Robert Pastorelli and Tom Sizemore and Dennis Farina, is of course incredibly beautiful. I mean, just truly stunning on the waters, on the Three Rivers. But she's not Sharon Stone. Speaking of another star of this era, she's a kind of an unconventional choice for an action, for the female love interest / internal affairs double agent in a Bruce Willis movie. I'd love to know what number choice she was for this part. Was she 5th? 7th?
Yeah.
It's a weird part. And on the one hand, I agree that there's like something really funny about that sex scene, and also something kind of steamy about it at the same time because it feels very obligatory. But it's a movie full of like just regular looking Pittsburghites. I don't know what the right frame there is, but that feels like very purposeful to me in a way.
Yeah, she doesn't have much of a. It feels in a way. I actually think the love story does her a bit of a disservice. It felt like, why couldn't they just have respect? She's out to nail him as an internal affairs investigator, and gains
Right.
her respect. And it didn't have to be romantic, but this is an era of Hollywood which doesn't have that kind of nuance, right? And they're like, hell, where's the sex scene?
Get naked, right?
Make it happen in one take. Put the soundtrack on it and just jam that scene in there. It needs to happen, and that stuff is clearly reshot, especially their pillow talk. If you look at their hair in that sequence,
Yeah, that's
which is
what I'm
always a fun
looking
game
at
to
in
play.
that scene. Okay.
That's how you find a reshoot. But that I hate that love story. I think it doesn't work. And other than that, I think she's an interesting character and a solid performance. But there's not too much substance there. But she's always like a delightful presence on screen. I think Sarah Jessica Parker.
Those are
And shout out to Kim Lee.
shout out to Kim Lee. Those are our
Gone
tenets
but not forgotten.
of an action movie. We live in a Twilight world, and now I think we gamify the show for a couple minutes. No, next we have the awards. Sean, did you bring your tuxedo? It looks like you're wearing a tuxedo right now.
Yes, I wear a tux
So
every
that's
podcast
good.
recording. I'm on. Yeah.
You, after doing the Oscars on the big picture, you were like, this is the right fit. This feels good. Like, this is me. So I'm going to put a tux on when I record from my house.
I do the Oscars night episode in athleisure, but then I do every other episode in a full tuxedo with tails, and I have a cane and a top hat. Yeah.
Why don't you do more video potting? This is my question.
I don't know. I don't. People don't need to see this face. This is not what God intended.
That's why we're all podcasters. The Die Hard Oscars, aka the Action Movie Awards, where we're going to be giving awards to these films. Phil, will you list the awards and the nominees?
Yes, our first award is the John McClane Yippee-Ki-Yay Award for the Best Line. And please feel free to add. These are my nominees, but please feel free to add. Let me rephrase that. Brackets, Rack's shotgun. I enjoyed that one. Let me rephrase that. I've never had a woman partner before. Neither have I, which is Sarah Jessica Parker's retort to Bruce Willis saying that. But the one that is my pick, there's an old Italian saying, "Don't scald your tongue on another man's soup," to which he responds, there's an old Irish saying, "Don't listen to old Italian sayings."
That's it. I mean, as an Irish Catholic from Boston, that's it.
That's it.
It's got to be that.
I thought that was pretty great.
Well, I have to give an honorable mention to when he refers to, at one point, she's like, "What's with your family and the cops?" And he says, "Oh, it's a nationwide negative gene pool." I thought was a pretty incredible thing for him to say midway through the movie.
Our next award is the Hans Gruber Exceptional Thief Award for stealing the film. And our nominees are Dennis Farina as Nick DiTillo, Sarah Jessica Parker as Joe Crispin / Emily Harper, and Tom Sizemore as Danny DiTillo. Nominees, cast your ballots.
I mean, I'm a Farina head for real. Like, I'm a deep, true Farina head. So with that, I gotta go. They gave Dennis so much to work with here. Yeah, for real. I think that this is like legitimately one of the most fun B+ character actor movies of the 1990s, and you could probably pick anybody. Brian James, Andre Braugher, everybody in this is good. Andre Braugher's, one real scene of cross-examination is fantastically fun. But this is, Farina, they should just remake this movie told through Farina's character's point of view. That would be an amazing movie too.
Exactly. No, I agree. I think this is Farina's movie, and I love Sizemore, as you know. But for me, my pick is definitely Farina. What do you think, Liam?
Oh yeah, Farina. Yeah, 100%.
All right, we'll move on to the Dick Thornburg Award for Dick of the movie. Now, there's an honorable mention here for Boat Preppy, played by Billy Hartung. But let's face it, this is a straight-up cockfight between Brian James as Detective Eddie Eiler, Hardy's boorish nemesis in Pittsburgh Homicide, and Timothy Busfield as Officer Sacco, Hardy's antagonistic colleague on the River Rescue Squad. Who you guys got for Dick of the movie?
Brian James for me. Brian James.
Yeah.
You know, the role he was born to play, which is the role he played in every single movie, which is the guy you just desperately want to punch in the face.
What do you mean I'm not helping?
It's next level in this film.
Oh, he sucks in the best way. He sucks in the best way.
Yeah, I agree. Detective Eddie Eiler all day. And finally, the best death presented by Marco.
No more table. God, it's like we're a bad radio show. We have to work on this.
We are.
We have to work on this.
Well, let's just
Things
own
need
it.
to change. Oh.
Now, there's a lot of parenticide, avunculicide, and attempted fratricide in this Greek tragedy. We've got 3 nominees. John Mahoney's sloppy demise at the hands of his friend and relative, Dennis Farina. Farina's death at the hands of his own son, Robert Pastorelli. And Robert Pastorelli being tasered in the mouth by his own cousin, Bruce Willis. Who you guys got for best death?
I think Eugene O'Neill introduced the idea of the taser in the mouth. That's just one thing I wanted to say. That was
I remember that scene.
Yeah. I think it's a direct crib from what is that originally from? Iceman Cometh, probably. It was Taser Man Cometh originally.
Cometh.
Yeah.
Taser Man, yeah. He rewrote it when the previews bombed in New Haven. They had to rework it, yeah.
That was originally an action movie, Iceman Cometh.
It was set on a river rescue squad, too. Yeah. Weird. I love Pastorelli's death. Legitimately original. I've not seen that before.
Yeah, it's pretty baller.
And we'll never see it again. The 90s was a golden age for tasers. Die Hard 2. Chekhov's taser, once again, makes its appearance in this movie. We see a taser early on. It comes back later on.
All right, I would agree. So we're all in agreement that it's Pastorelli getting tasered in the mouth. Let's move on to our final section of the show, which is the Double Jeopardy quiz, where the scores can really change. So we've got 3 trivia questions for you guys. Do you want to collaborate or compete?
I feel like, Sean, you should compete because you're going to kick my ass on this, and I don't want to drag you down into the Pittsburgh Allegheny River.
Okay, I will compete, but I'm no promises here. You know, as I mentioned to you guys, I'm a little bit rusty on the podcasting front. It's been weeks since I've been in front of a microphone.
No one knows. You didn't even have to admit that here. All right.
The rules are very simple. There are 3 questions, and each time you can phone a friend, i.e. you can radio Al Powell, and I will give you 1 clue. Okay. Question number 1. Dennis Farina plays Robert Pastorelli's father in the film. But can you guess the age difference between the 2 actors at the time of filming?
12 years?
I was going to say 14 years.
Ooh, little Price is Right action. Gotcha.
The answer is 10 years.
Ah,
Farina
10
was
years.
49 and Pastorelli was 39, and yet they played father and son.
See, this is tricky because Dennis Farina looks like he's 50 forever.
Exactly.
So it's tricky
Yeah,
for you to pull this.
It's a weird one.
This is hard.
It's a weird one.
You said it, Liam.
He would look 49 and out of sight. So I don't know.
He looked 49 like 5 years ago.
That's
I
true.
know, it's so weird. It's such he bends space and time. Question number 2. Cult character actor Brian James would act opposite Bruce Willis again in which 1997 movie?
The Fifth Element?
Is correct.
Oh, I thought it was Mercury Rising, but then I realized that might have been later on. So I don't know.
Yeah. Brian James plays a character called General Monroe. in The
Mercury
Fifth
Rising
Element.
heads? No. Okay,
Yeah, where
cool.
that's the other thing on film Twitter. They're just non-stop.
Mercury Rising. Yeah.
Hashtag
Die Hard on a whatever.
Justice for Mercury Rising.
Yep.
Which we will provide eventually on this show.
All right.
All right,
Oh,
our final one is we'll do convoluted corner. Corner. All right. Question number 3. Striking Distance touches on the idea of wrongful incarceration. Striking Distance co-star Tom Sizemore made his big screen debut in which 1989 prison drama which also explored this subject.
Lock Up?
Yes.
Lock Up. Wow.
It's Lock Up. Liam, you are correct. Sizemore plays Dallas. It also stars Die Hard 2's John Amos.
Big Lockup
so
House.
technically,
That
you've
was a
got
big
one.
movie in my house growing up. My dad loved Lockup.
It's a fun one. There is a tiebreaker if you want it, but we can put you out of your misery and let you go if you want. But would you like the tiebreaker, or do you need to?
We're not tied. Liam has won, but I love trivia, so we should do it.
Should we do it?
By the way, I've never seen Lockup, which I think I talked about on the Sylvester Stallone episode recently.
Lockup is good. We seem to mention two things on every episode of this podcast. One is Paul Verhoeven, and the other is Lockup.
I gotta check out Lockup. Jeez, I love John Flynn too.
It's worth seeing.
Yeah, it's a fun kind of elevated B movie. Okay, you got. Well, I'm calling it that you got one each, and that neither of you got the first one. So let's make it interesting, right? Okay. Final question. Another cult character actor, Tom Atkins, appears briefly here as Sergeant Fred Hardy, Bruce Willis's uncle. Tom Atkins had a particularly memorable demise in which iconic Joel Silver produced 1987 action movie.
Lethal Weapon
Is the correct answer. Bonus question. What tipple was Hunsaker swigging at the moment of his death?
Tipple?
What was he swigging when Gary Busey showed up in the helicopter and then shot him? Eggnog.
Ah, it's a
Eggnog.
Christmas
Why? Because Lethal Weapon is a
movie.
Christmas movie. Sean, do you think Die Hard is a Christmas movie?
Yes, of course I do.
Thank God.
I was hoping there was going to be a Halloween.
Make sure Bill doesn't listen to this.
Yeah, don't worry, he won't. I was hoping that the Atkins question was going to be a Halloween 3 question, but alas.
Oh, are you season of the Witch Head?
Huge Season of the Witch Head. Huge.
I love that movie.
Me too.
I love
it
that
too.
movie. It's so weird.
Silver Shamrock.
First there was Season of the Witch Hive, then there was Babylon Hive, and soon there will be Tenet Hive. That's where we're all going with this.
And then
That's
Striking
where it all
Distance Hive.
culminates.
That's the final chapter.
Speaking of which, any final thoughts on the movie, Sean? We've kept you for so long. It's been so great to have you on. Anything you wanna add?
This is a perfectly fine movie from the 1990s that I think people should watch if they like movies like this. If they haven't seen it, and they've listened this far, they're deranged, but it's nice of them to spend some time with us. I had fun doing it. I think I find it to be...
Most of our listeners are deranged.
I really like talking about older movies that are not considered iconic. And so a lot of what I do is talk about iconic movies, or beloved movies, or movies that are under massive reconsideration. And this is what you guys are doing on the show is really fun, and it's fun to spend some time in an otherwise forgotten corner of the universe. So thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you, and we'd love to have you back to talk about another forgotten movie at some point in the future. So we'd love for you to join us again.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's been an absolute blast to have you, and we're huge fans of the rewatchables and the big picture and you in general. And it was a real treat to have you on the show. So thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you, Liam. Appreciate it, guys.
Phil,
Yes,
that was a lot of fun.
I was.
And
We got in
hopefully-
there on striking distance.
We got in there. Hopefully it was so much fun that you're going to take a minute and you're going to click on your phone there and click 5 stars and say that Striking Distance episode was a lot of fun. Maybe you'll write a review. Loved the Striking Distance episode with Sean Fennessey. Maybe
Not
you'll
to put
tell a
words in
friend.
your mouth, but
Yeah, but say you love it.
that type of thing.
Say you love it. And please tell a friend. If you have an action-loving friend, if you know some dads in your life, you just listen to 4 40-ish dads, 3 40-ish dads talk about a forgotten thriller from 1993. There may be people like that in your life. Perhaps your dad. Maybe you're 6 years old and you're listening to this podcast. I don't know. But tell someone that you know about this podcast. You can find us on X. Formerly Twitter. I'm at Liam G. Billingham, and I'm often tweeting about Tenet. Phil, how's X treating you lately?
Yeah, I'm on it a bit more now. Even though there are, let's just say, there are some issues with the site and some of the things that go on there. But I will say I have found a lovely community of film fans, and I tweet about more than just Hard Boiled now. So I'm growing. On that medium.
It's an investment in your time, and you have to decide how much you want to be on there. But there are great people on it, and we've had a lot of fun talking with them about Striking Distance.
Absolutely.
If you have thoughts on this episode, thoughts on the relationship between Chief Wiggum P.I. and Long Day's Journey into Night, and how they, if you play them at the same time, like a Pink Floyd record and Wizard of Oz, they sync up. If you have thoughts on that or anything else action movie related, I need to be stopped. Please email us at diehardoab@gmail.com, and a representative will get right back to you. Phil,
Yes.
what's next on the show?
Next on the show is Demolition Man.
Sylvester Stallone, Wesley Snipes,
Sandra Bullock, Dennis
classic.
Leary,
Who directed Demolition Man?
Marco Brambilla.
His only film, right? Isn't
His
it
only film. He was an artist, I believe, a performance artist. It's going to be a good one. It's a popular movie. It's a terrific movie. It's a wildly entertaining movie, and I think it has something pretty interesting to say about action movie archetypes. So we'll be getting into that.
And we have a great
soon.
guest. We're not going to
We
say who
do.
it is, but we have a very exciting guest. We still have to record with him, which is why we aren't saying who it is, but we're really excited. And it's actually going to be the first time I've seen this movie in its entirety since 1994. I'm going to say that. So I'm excited to revisit it. And also, if you're interested in Demolition Man content, I tell the same story about seeing the trailer for this movie with my dad before The Fugitive on both our episode for Cliffhanger with Jamel Bowie and The Fugitive with Adam Volerich and Dom Nero of Eye of the Duck. So if you haven't listened to those episodes and you want to hear my really stupid story, and I can't believe I told it twice, go check out those episodes.
And if you're a fan of the Rewatchables and you enjoyed Sean's guesting today, we also had Rewatchables regular Kyle Brandt on last week for our Hard Target deep dive, which was an amazing episode as well.
Talk about a mensch. Kyle Brandt. We've just been
swimming in menches.
I don't know what's going on over at The Ringer, but they got
They're
some
such
great people.
They really are.
It's so cool. All right. I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm Philip Gawthorne.
And we'll be back next time with some new FBI guys.
On the streets of San Angeles.
Ooh.
I mixed it up. I
liked it.
I played
the
a little
music's
jazz.
already fading in, so nobody can hear this. Die Hard on a Blank is a podcast created and hosted by Philip Gawthorne. Liam Billingham co-hosts and produces the show. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at DieHardOAB. Rate, review, follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, tell your movie podcast-loving friends about Die Hard on a Blank. Special thanks to Suki Chu. See you next time on Die Hard on a Blank.